you think about the fact that this soil probably took hundreds of years to form.
Hello, my name is Christine Brown. I'm a field crop sustainability specialist.
It is Monday, March the 23rd, and that means that we're back for another March Manure Mondays 2026. On behalf of Christine Brown, myself, Andrew Barry, and the entire Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Agribusiness, we're thrilled to have you back and joining us today. Last week, we looked at an episode that was called From Pit to Profit. And we had a number of producers talking about their integrated manure management systems, the costs associated with that, and even a little bit on methane. That recording is available, and I've seen quite a few folks have viewed it already. So circle back to Field Crop News on YouTube if you'd like to see any of the previous recordings, but new topic today. So what are we talking about today? Today is manure safety. And as we head into the spring season, it is now spring, and the equipment's going to be running, the manure is going to be going out. It is a good time to be reminded that we've got to be careful and aware of what we're working with, who we're working with, our livestock, and risks to them and to us. So this is going to be all about manure safety today. Typical format, we will finish at 3 o'clock. There is one Certified Crop Advisor credit being offered. That QR code will be posted at the end. We love your comments and your questions, so please be active in the chat, but we don't need to hear your dog and your cat, so stay on mute if you would. Okay, I'm going to jump right in here, and again, we're going to look at this as really a total mixed ration when we talk about safety, because it could be talking about gases, it could be talking about equipment, road safety, diseases of livestock. You know, some of you folks are out doing crop scouting and you're out doing consultant work in the fields. You need to be aware of the things that you've got to be careful of as well. So we've got 4 wonderful presenters today, and I would like to introduce them all. You can see them on the screen. We will start with Walter Grose, and Walter is with Husky Farm Equipment in Alma and also part of the Farm Safety Association. Then we have Bill Tenhove, who is he's not new to being a manure applicator. He's done this for a year or two. He's part of OPACA and is in the Atwood area, so we're going to hear some good stories from Bill. And then we have 2 veterinarians joining us as well. We have Conor Voth, who is a swine vet with Demeter Veterinary Services. And we have Dr. Cynthia Mittenburg, who is a colleague of mine, and she is one of our lead veterinarians. So welcome to you all. Thanks for being on the panel today. And we're going to let you go one at a time first before we bring you all back together and have our total mixed ration discussion at the end. So Walter, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you start us off.
Thank you very much, Andrew. First of all, I'd appreciate everybody that's listening today to understand what can happen with manure gas when you're working with liquid manure. And I'm sure it can happen with solid manure, but my goal is liquid manure. I've spent 45 years working with liquid manure while I was at Husky Farm Equipment. So last year I sold the business to the boys, And now I can go around and spend some time and teach people about handling liquid manure safely. So we'll have our first slide up if we can. And 25 years ago, when we had an accident in Drayton where 3 people were killed inside a manure spreader, I started doing some research. I wanted to figure out just when does this hydrogen sulfide build up? It's a silent gas. You can't smell it. You can't see it. And it sneaks up on you. And all of a sudden, you're dead, lying beside the manure spreader, and you have no idea why. So what I did was I took a 3-gas monitor and I put it up at the very top of the manure spreader while the manure spreader was filling. So you can see that I had lots of carbon monoxide, but I had 151 of hydrogen sulfide. And if you look at the oxygen at 20.9, that's a standard day in Ontario. Our oxygen is 20.9. So we didn't have a lack of oxygen. We had poisonous gas present at the top of that manure spreader. So then we went out and we spread the load of liquid manure. And immediately I climbed up on top of the manure spreader and I stuck the hose down inside. And because we had a 3-gas monitor with the dragger in it, we were able to actually take a sample of the manure down in the bottom of the manure spreader. So that's quite high. 70 parts per million is high. And if you notice, the oxygen inside the manure spreader was still at 20.9. So now we emptied the manure spreader. We drained it. We opened the hole at the front and we drained all the manure right out of the manure spreader. Now you can see that there's some carbon monoxide, but there is 25 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide. So with these 3-gas monitors, they're set to go off at 15 parts per million. So 15 parts per million. And that's when it smells like rotten eggs. And I don't know how many of you have been to high school when you could smell those rotten egg bombs the kids let off in high school, but that's 15 parts per million. At 25 parts per million, workman's compensation says that you have to go home for 8 hours of fresh air. So that means if you're stirring a manure pit or agitating, or you get a whiff of manure after your monitor goes off, then you need to go home for 8 hours of fresh air. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a 3-gas monitor. This is a simple monitor that you turn on. It stays on. It's only monitoring 1 gas, and it monitors hydrogen sulfide. It's good for 2 years or 3 years. We sell the 3-year one now. And the goal with that monitor is that you wear it all the time. It's on 24 hours a day. Preferably you put it on your belt or you put it on your rubber boot. And the reason for that is that you want to make sure that it's low. Hydrogen sulfide is a heavy gas. It's lower than oxygen and it stays down near along the bottom. So you need to make sure that your monitor is there so that you have time to get out. Next slide. So a 3-gas monitor is able to record your carbon monoxide, your oxygen, and your hydrogen sulfide. And that's how we can find out if there's cross-contamination with methane, or you also can add a hose to those so they can have a fan, a dragger hose, and then you can actually monitor stuff when you're not in the area. So you don't have to have the monitor on you. You can shove the hose inside and then you can monitor that. So we do not want you to let these monitors down in the manure spreader because the sensors can get wrecked. And so the goal is to put a hose in down in the manure spreader and then monitor it that way. And now you can go to the next slide. So this is how we work at Husky Farm Equipment. These are a 3-gas monitor and it's in a bump test bay. And our monitors have to be bump tested every day before the shift. They have to be bump tested after lunch. If you have them out of the manure spreader for a while and sitting on your workbench before you go back in the manure spreader, then you have to test again. So we need to use these monitors if we are in a dry manure spreader, brand new, or in a used one. All right, next slide. So when I mentioned before that if you're walking around a manure pit while you're mixing, it's really important. So in Wisconsin, we had one of our farmers that actually passed away from walking around the manure pit while he was agitating. So that means that it was higher than 100, and we don't actually know where the levels are. And I can explain some of that to you of where the safety levels are. At 25 parts per million, you can start to not smell the rotten egg gas anymore. At 100 parts per million, you will get a headache. All right. And so some people say that 100 parts per million, they work in a pig barn all day long at 100 parts per million. And when they go in at night, they will have a terrible headache. And that's an indication that your barn needs more air circulation. And when you get to as high as 300 to 1,000, you have instant death. And people say that, well, you maybe get knocked out or you maybe go unconscious. Who wants to take the risk? Because with hydrogen sulfide, you have one breath, you breathe in, but you don't get to breathe out. And so we don't have a chance to say, oh, this smells bad, because your nose, your olfactories are burned on the very first whiff, and you can't smell anything. So after 100 parts per million, you've already lost all capability of smelling the hydrogen sulfide. Okay, next slide. So when we go in a manure spreader at Husky, we have a confined space form that we have to fill in. So there's the form that we fill in every time that we go in a manure spreader. That's why I have them typed out ahead of time. But any farmer, every custom operator that has an employee for more than 1 hour a year must belong to workman's comp and have all OSHA compliant around the farm. And so if he wants some young lad at 16 years old to come and get inside the manure spreader and wash it out, he has to have all these forms filled in ahead of time, and he has to have a 3-day confined space entry program, and he has to have rescue all on hand, and he has to know what to do. So it's not a system where you can just jump in a manure spreader. Next page. So all of these forms that we fill in, you have a red form that has all the hazards. Then you have a yellow form that has what's left. And then you have a green form that tells you that you can go inside a manure spreader. So unless that red, yellow, and green form are filled in, we can't go in a manure spreader. Once you're covered under OSHA and workman's comp, you can't go back in a manure spreader. All right, I think that's the end of my slides. So I'll just explain a few short stories real quick. And when you have an accident where somebody is killed inside a manure spreader, it's devastating. And it hurts the family, it hurts the farm, and people don't recover. We were on a farm in New York, and a farmer had a long tractor trailer sitting there. And I said, well, why don't you use a tractor trailer to go out and haul manure? And he said, no. He said, 10 years ago, we lost an employee in that tractor trailer, and we will never use it again. And it's not leaving here, because that's a constant reminder that the safety we need on that farm. I was talking to a beef farmer one day, and he said that the cows were all dropping dead in the barn because he was mixing the manure. And so he ran to the door, and he couldn't get to the door because there was too many cows. And just then a cow dropped dead right in front of him. He jumped over the cow, and he went outside and landed and passed out. And it was a while before he recovered. And I did show you a picture of the man filling the manure spreader. I showed you that picture of the Husky spreader being loaded. We had a man that crawled up to the top of the ladder to look in the hole to see how full the manure spreader actually was. And he passed out. He fell back onto the ground behind the manure spreader. And when he woke up, the manure was right up to his neck, and just his head was exposed out of the manure. It had actually filled the valley, and it had emptied most of the manure pit out, and he was there in that liquid manure. So things that we think are quite easy, such as fixing a liquid manure spreader, needs to have precautions, and we need to make sure that we take safety note. Last year, there was 2 gentlemen that passed away in a manure spreader in New York. The rubber hose just jumped in the manure spreader, and they thought, well, they could go in after it and they could get that rubber hose. And the problem with that is that they had let that manure spreader sit over lunch. The sun had got on the spreader, the hydrogen sulfide started to build up, and they went in right after lunch, and the first one passed away, and then the second one went in right after that. and he passed away as well. So 29 and 31 years old. When they left in the morning and they kissed their wife goodbye and they said, "Hey, see you tonight after work," they didn't know that they weren't going to be home. So most of those deaths that I'm talking about, they were bedding with a different product. Most farmers bed with sawdust, or they bed with sand, or they bed with actual bedding, dried bedding. But some of them are using gypsum or drywall as bedding because it's got that lime in it and it mixes with it. But this actually will increase the hydrogen sulfide. So if you're bedding with gypsum or you're bedding with drywall, it will actually increase the hydrogen sulfide numbers. And we are seeing more and more deaths over that. Last story that I have is in some of the new barns now, they have reception pits, which are dry well reception pits. So the manure pumps are in a pit, and then they have an area that's like 10 feet by 10 feet, and the hoses go down into that, and then they all get piped underground to the manure storage facility. And when one of those hose breaks, the workers go down there and they pull that hose off to replace that hose if it was broken. And just this summer, August of this 2025, we had 6 workers pass away in one barn at one time in one farm. The reason is they were down doing maintenance. So they had the farm, they had the construction crew, and they had another group that was there doing maintenance. So there was 3 different companies involved in that accident, and all 6 of those people passed away. They were family members. They were most of the men from one family. And they were told by the foreman, do not go in. Do not go in the manure tank. Do not, or in that reception area. It will be dangerous. But they were just going down to change a hose. And I think that people do not see, like, even though it's a dry well, they don't see that there could be hazardous gas, because as soon as they take that hose apart, that's when the hazardous gas comes back up in. So I will end there, and anybody else that has questions, we'll do them after winter in our group. Thank you.
Thanks, Walter. And boy, I don't think anybody's napping right now. That's wow. So, Bill, we're going to turn it over to you now. And boy, I know you've got stories as well, but tell us a few, Bill.
Well, my name is Bill Tenhove. I run a custom farming business near Atwood. I've been in business since I was 19, so it's over 40 years. We've seen a lot of things happen. There's 2 things I'd like to point out in that's happening with manure is the speed of the tractors and the size of the manure tanks and road safety. We had better start taking this seriously, because my neighbor flipped his manure spreader the other day, solid manure spreader. Speed and winter conditions maybe helped a little there, but if we don't start taking this seriously, they will start mandating us to get serious about it. So that's just my little about road hazard. The main thing I want to talk about is drag hose safety and air compressors and building pressure blowing lines out. And we had an instance where we had plugged our hoses with sand, and we had to break every hose at every coupler and push a ball out with air, and we had to cut the coupler off the other end for the sand to come out. We had about a mile of hose out, so we did that to every hose. And the very last hose we did, the farmers were standing beside me, and we're starting to blow, and we had an educated guy at the other end who would turn the compressor on and off as needed. But once you have your airline 3/4 full of air, it's like an air tank, and when it goes, it goes. And we were standing up by the pit, and I said to the farmer, get in behind the tractor here in case something happens. And he didn't. He said he wanted to see it blow off. I said, no, get in here behind me. Just as I said that, it went. And that hose come back about 200 feet and knocked him flat on his ass. And he had a mark from his belt up to the side of his face. You could see where the hose hit him. And if there was a coupler on that hose, it would have killed him. He doesn't know how close he was to being hurt bad that day. So just watch the air. Air is deadly. I said, manure will make you dirty, but air will kill you. And if you could show that video, which we show at the Manure Expo, the demo, you can see what kind of energy is behind this hose. If we could run that video now.
Count of three. 1, 2, 3.
That shows you how much energy is in the hose. And if there would have been a coupler on that hose that you released there, like a coupler is like 25 pounds of aluminum coming at you. If that hits you in the head, you're not going to be here tomorrow. So I see so many farmers stand on the hose, kick the hose, do this. It's like, no, just stand back. I've seen them blow off the pumps under manure pressure too. And I've heard stories where it'll break your leg because it comes off there so hard. I've seen them pop off. I've seen them hit the barn. I have never seen anybody hurt in my situations, but I've heard of it. So just be careful. It's not, slow down and take your time, and you'll be here tomorrow. I guess that's what I want to say.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that message. And wow, seeing that video, oh my goodness. It's just hard to fathom. So, all right, we're going to carry on. We'll change gears a little bit as we go to the veterinarians, and we'll start with Conor. Go for it, Conor, and turn it over to you.
Yeah, my name's Conor. So I'm looking a little bit more at disease risk mitigation. How do you reduce risk to your livestock species and spreading disease to them from spreading manure? So yeah, I'm a swine vet. So this is coming from someone who has basically only a swine background. So it is a little bit swine focused, but I tried to touch on things that apply to every species. So we know that there are a number of pathogens that can survive in manure. I got a number of species here and a couple different, it's not all encompassing, but a couple different pathogens. I'm going to skip the ruminants here just because Dr. Mittenburg will touch on that. But when you look at swine and poultry, you can see that there's some pathogens that can survive quite a while. In swine, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, or PED, is something that Ontario's been struggling with. For anyone who isn't into pigs, it causes 100% mortality in piglets about 10 to 12 days of age, and we're in the biggest outbreak Ontario's ever seen right now. Important concept about it is that it can survive in slurry, so kind of like pit or lagoon material, for about 15 to 18 months. So it can survive a long, long time, even if you get it out of, the animals in the barn. It's going to be living in that pit for a long time. So if your barn breaks in December, and there's been tons and tons of barns that are broken this winter, it's likely still living in that manure that's going to be spread in the springtime. PRRS is another super important disease in swine, probably the most important in North America, and it too can survive not quite as long, but it can survive for a number of days in manure. Poultry, if I'm being honest, I'm not even close to a poultry expert. I learned about poultry in vet school and haven't looked at it since, but I asked a poultry vet just to name a couple pathogens that could maybe survive in manure, and he gave me a few here. I did a little bit of research into HPAI because I was interested, and the highest number I found in a research study was about 7 to 10 months survival in manure. It's a very, I think, specific HPAI strain, and you're probably not going to have too many strains that are living that long, but there are some out there that can live quite a while. So we do have a good idea that there are a number of pathogens that can survive for quite a while in manure. So we know they can survive in manure. Has there been any evidence that manure spreading will actually cause breaks in barns? This was a study looking at PRRS and pigs that essentially proved this. They looked at tons of different pigs in different sites, and they were able to determine that if you're pumping manure in a pig barn, that there's about a 3.5 times chance that it will break with PRRS in the next 5 weeks. Similarly, if you have manure being spread in the area close by a pig barn, it's about 3 times higher chance that it will break with PRRS if it's within 5 kilometers, and about a 4 times chance that it will break if the manure is spread within 1.6 kilometers. They also found that tank hauling had about a 50% chance lower odds of breaking a barn than drag hose systems. So there is evidence out there showing that manure spreading can cause disease outbreaks in livestock. So what have I personally experienced? Going back a few years, we had an isolated group of barns that broke with PED all at the same time, with some correlation to manure spreading. This was a few years ago, before PED really became as big of an issue year over year as it is right now. But we had a barn break May 24th that year. A custom hauler had been spreading the manure on their site and had been at a farm recently that had broken with PED in the winter. They had a staff member that was walking outside in the barn boots and walked directly into the barn. So this is how we think it broke. Basically, a PED manure spreader contaminated with PED around the farm was being used, and then boots were used outside the farm and then walked directly into the barn. We then had 2 other producers break on May 28th shortly after. We couldn't find a direct correlation back to that barn that broke May 24th. We just learned that on one of these farms, a producer had been walking in and out of the barn to take out garbage with the barn boots. So that's how we think we got into the farm. Just not sure how PED got to the site in the first place. And then finally, on June 4th, we had a producer that was using a manure hauler used on one of these farms that broke in May. He actually used it for beef manure first, but then walked with his barn boots through where his beef cattle were directly into his pig barn, which then subsequently broke. So it was an interesting case where we had a lot of correlation between manure spreading of equipment that were contaminated with PED, then leading to pig barns breaking with it. So what can you actually do to mitigate risk of bringing disease to your animals? A big thing is using farm-specific equipment if possible. If you're not bringing equipment from another farm, then there's a lot less likelihood you're bringing pathogens from another farm to yours. If you are using equipment that's used at multiple sites, spreading manure at a site that contains different species as compared to the manure you're spreading is a good idea, just because there's not a ton of pathogens that infect multiple types of our livestock. So if you have pig manure, if you're spreading on a dairy farm, it's a lot safer than if you're spreading that pig manure on a pig farm. If you're using equipment that's used on multiple sites, then sequencing the equipment so that you are doing these breaks between species is a good way to try and mitigate that risk. So if you're doing pig barn, you can then go to a dairy farm, you can go back to a pig barn or maybe a poultry farm. And again, you're just reducing the contamination of that equipment with the species you start with. If you do have to spread manure at the site of the same species, then with some species you can mitigate risk by going to lower risk animals, or just animals that if they break can either take it better, or it's easier to eliminate from the site. So with pigs again, finishing barn, if you're spreading pig manure, spreading it around a finishing barn is a lot less risky than a sow barn, just because it's typically a lot easier to get disease out of a finishing barn, especially if it's all in, all out, versus a sow barn. Likewise, finishing pigs are usually much more resistant to disease than little piglets. And then cleaning and disinfecting equipment between farms is an awesome idea. Spraying off that organic matter and then using a disinfectant is also a great way to reduce contamination. If you're using a custom hauler, it's good to know where they've been or ask where they've been. Have you asked if they go to a different species before your farm? Ask if they've been to a farm that's in an outbreak situation. You want to prevent any manure contaminated items from getting back into a barn. So boots, equipment, this sort of thing, you want to clean it off before bringing it back to the barn, or just best case scenario, don't ever bring it into the barn if possible. Looking at the route, if you're using a manure hauler and tractor on multiple sites, knowing the route is a good idea. Yeah, kind of have like multiple options to take from one farm to another, taking the route that passes by the least amount of livestock operations as what is being contained in the manure hauler is a good idea. So if you're spreading dairy manure, you can go one way that has 5 pig barns, or another way that has 5 dairy farms to get to the next site. Going by the pig farms would be the best option. Soil injection reduces contamination as opposed to surface broadcasting. Of course, it's not always possible with every species, or easy, I should say, but it is a better option when possible. Avoiding applicating in windy conditions, if possible, can reduce manure getting spread around and manure particles by the wind. And then tank hauled systems are typically safer than drag hose systems, but again, they're not always the easiest or best option, or not what is set up for your operation. And then finally, people biosecurity is important. So if you're hauling manure, it's often a good idea to use boots and clothing that will not, when you're applying the manure, that will not be brought back to the farm. And when you're going back to your farm, it's good to change into barn boots and clothes, and use any other entry biosecurity procedures you have, such as Danish entries or showers. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass it over to Dr. Miltenberg.
And so thanks for handing it off to me, Connor. And there are some overlap for sure between cattle and swine. So some of the messaging is the same. Of course, biosecurity is essential in all livestock commodities. So looking just a little further at some specific cattle pathogens, what I've broken them down here is I could come up with endless lists, and there's a lot of research that looks at varying times that pathogens will survive within manure, and that's related, and the variation might be related to the conditions that the manure is tested under, tank types, liquid, solid manure is much more common in some areas of cattle production. So these variations lead to some variability in the time that you'll find in research. But how I look at it is kind of 3 categories. The column there where I have days to weeks are pathogens that have shorter survival, but they're still really important for immediate spread or processing of manure. And so these pathogens will be present and will be eliminated within a few weeks. But if you're going to be spreading right away, they will be present. We have pathogens in the category of months here. So some of our salmonellas are E. coli, including O157H7, which you might be familiar with because it's also a foodborne illness pathogen of concern. Some antimicrobial resistant bacteria. With antimicrobial resistance, we can see transfer of those genes between bacteria, even when the original bacteria die, and they can remain available to be taken up by other bacteria. And of note here, I pointed out highly pathogenic avian influenza in cattle. Although we have not seen this to date in Ontario, our colleagues in the US have gained some experience with it in the livestock industry in an outbreak that they've gone through 2024 and 2025. And there's much research here, mostly from the poultry side of things. Although cattle don't primarily shed HPAI in their manure, it may be present in manure storage because of the disposal of milk or other substances that were fluids from cattle that were infected. And then we have categories that we call the many months. For example, Johne's disease caused by Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. This can survive for almost up to a year in our pits and lagoons, some Clostridia and Coccidia organisms as well. And so for these, we're thinking a little bit more, there's this in this middle category, a persistent risk, even during normal manure storage periods. And then finally, kind of more of a long-term environmental risk with a contamination risk. And of course, we have many situations, we have continuous manure addition, which means manure might have a range of fresh to old material in it. And so even when we have some time, we might have fresh manure included. So I would like to emphasize here that manure doesn't have to look dirty to be risky. And many pathogens are shed by even clinically normal, healthy animals. In particular, our young stock, our sick cattle, and our cattle around the period of calving. So disease risk, where does it come from? It comes from any time that we have this intersection between manure, between animals, between people, and the equipment moving any of these around on farms. So on dairy farms or beef farms, we have a couple of high-risk areas or transmission pathways. So it's not just about manure storage or manure application, but starts on the farm with the way that we move manure and fecal matter through barns. So we have transmission risks just through our daily activities, right? Pathogens can be spread by equipment, by boots, by shared farm areas, much like Conor mentioned in his talk. And we have critical high risk areas. So calving pens and calf housing are high risk, not only because these animals are more likely to be shedding pathogens, but also because they contain our vulnerable newborns that don't have very much immunity yet. Feed alleys and waterers are at risk for contamination, with then subsequent infection spread to a large number of animals. And then there's some risks from when we move manure or we have runoff and land application where we can spread the pathogens a little more widely. So when I'm visiting a farm and I'm reviewing manure risk and pathogen risk, I'm often, these pictures on the right-hand side here are my key areas where I'm looking through for risk related to so shared equipment between all these areas or storage areas is a huge risk. Young or sick animals are most likely to be shedding, and overcrowding puts us at particular risk. And then conditions that are beyond our control, wet, cold conditions, which change the survival of some of these pathogens, or when we can't store manure for as long as we'd like, can be a risk. I also want to point out that there can be some people risks from manure too, from a zoonosis perspective. So zoonosis is diseases that can move from animals to people or vice versa. And particularly, we have risk here for our more vulnerable people, such as children, some elderly individuals, and potentially immunocompromised individuals. And this can be a risk when we have direct contact with farm families, their employees, the visitors who come onto farms, or contamination when we have soil or water, or even fresh produce that's contaminated that can lead to foodborne illness. But it doesn't have to be a huge problem. We can mitigate the risk dramatically with just a few simple steps. Hand washing is super important, and changing boots or washing boots. I'm having visitor protocols as well that protect those individuals. We can reduce pathogens in manure. Starting at the animal, animals will be influenced by some factors in their diet, such as the grain level, the fermentability of the diet, and the protein that's included. And these factors affect rumen fermentation and the gut pH, as well as the passage rate through the animal, and the availability of the substrate for the microbes in ruminant in the rumen. And so these are important factors that we know that dietary strategies can be part of disease prevention and manure risk management. And then on any measures that are supporting animal health and reducing stress is also supporting a reduction in pathogens. I am not an expert in manure management beyond the animal, I'll admit, and look to my manure colleagues to give a lot more details on the processing of manure once it's outside of the barn. But anaerobic storage conditions, composting, and storage for at least 60 days are factors that do overall impact the pathogen level when manure comes out of storage. And then when manure is actually applied, there's a number of pathogens that are susceptible to UV light and drying. And so these, such as Salmonellas and E. coli, will be affected considerably by light. And we want to, of course, time it appropriately and mitigate runoff to also reduce the pathogens that we're spreading. On dairy farms or beef farms, I love aerial shots. They really give me insight to how farms work. And so many of the pathogens that we're trying to protect or mitigate against, they already exist in the facility. They're not necessarily introduced from outside, and we're just doing our best with biosecurity within the premise to make sure that we're not exposing animals unnecessarily. So measures that we can take that avoid spills and leakage, particularly in driveways, using clean equipment, as Conor already elucidated too, and preventing cross-contamination with sharing of equipment. Vehicle routes is one that we really emphasize, I think is really important. If you can imagine where vehicles need to move on this or any site that you're visiting, and how that traffic also brings vehicles that are going directly towards animal housing and vulnerable animals is really important. So we kind of look to see clean and dirty routes in that we're not taking, for example, a vehicle that's there to deliver or pick up animals through the same route that manure equipment is going to be traversing. So just to wrap it up, manures, it's a normal part of cattle production. It can also pose some animal health risks. We need to balance those risks between our pathogen control and all the other priorities we have about manure, such as what the storage limits are, balancing nutrients when we apply it, etc. But just from a livestock side of things, and particularly from a ruminant, cattle, even small ruminants, we increase our risk when we do have contamination or cross-contamination with feed and water, exposure of our young or stressed animals, or when we have high traffic or confined areas. So we're trying to protect those so we can protect animal health, productivity, and the human health or zoonosis risk. So I'll end there.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to welcome all four panelists, and we'll have a kitchen table discussion here. And again, pretty broad spectrum of stuff. First thing I'm going to do, just because there's a couple of things in the chat, is I want to address those first. And Dr. Voth, I'm going to go to you in the first question. Mark, who is a swine farmer, is asking, what about manure outside in lagoons? Wondering about the sun-killing PED.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, but I think unfortunately in practice it doesn't always work. I know a vet that used to be the head vet for Seaboard Foods down in the States, and he actually experimented with this. He had a finishing barn break in Oklahoma, where it's quite a bit warmer than here in Ontario. Barn broke, they cleaned it up, and then 60 weeks after they broke, they took lagoon water, fed it back to naive piglets, which then broke to PED. So he was essentially able to prove that even in this lagoon in Oklahoma, for 60 weeks, much of the air is baking in the hot sun. It wasn't able to kill all the virus that was there. So I think that it theoretically should probably reduce viral load a bit with that increased temperature and UV radiation. However, it's hardy enough that it can serve the vast majority of it can likely still survive.
Mm. And Walter, I think this might have been referring to you. Did you mention the Colorado situation? I thought you did. Yeah. So yeah, you did in your stories tell that. Walter, though, while I got you, you made a comment. You were showing the gas testers, and the first one, which just H2S, and I caught the fact that you say basically there's an expiry date on those units, right? Like how long are they good for? How do you know when, okay, this unit's done?
So 3 years is the one we sell standard, and at the end of 3 years, it just turns off. And so it always fails to safe. If the battery was to die earlier, the screen just goes off. If the sensor quits, the battery just goes off. So it fails safe no matter what. If it's not reading, you need a new tester. The part of the hydrogen sulfide problem is people don't know when it's there because its colors is odorless. So, like, we had a farmer that said, if you want to go in a manure spreader, you just jump in when it's fresh, and then that's the best time. And he was spreading manure on a Sunday morning, and he got something in the manure spreader. He jumped in the manure spreader. He didn't get killed by hydrogen sulfide, but the trouble is it was a winter morning, like today, and he got trapped inside and he couldn't get out because there was no ladder to get out of the thing. So he eventually took off his white underwear and he waved it around over his head out of the manhole, and some lady going to church stopped and got him out of the spreader. So it is important to always test your manure spreader because, again, yes, gypsum and drywall make it a higher chance that the hydrogen sulfide will be increased, but it could be anywhere at any time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. And Dr. Voth, I'm going to circle back to you again, because again, Martin's asking in the chat more about PED in terms of the minimum distance that you might want to be away. So a barn has been infected, you're going to be applying manure. What's the minimum distance to consider that you should be away to protect your own property?
I don't really have a specific number. I would just say as far as possible. In the literature, it's been shown that like you can find after manure like spreading, you can find genetic material up to 10 miles away, but it wasn't, at least in that when they looked at it, it wasn't able to infect it. So it seemed like maybe it was dead virus. And then they've been shown that, you get some infected air and you expose pigs to it, it can make them, it can infect them, but there's not, as far as I know, there's not a lot of research that says that this is the specific distance away. So for me, it's just as far as possible. And although there's a lot of good indications that PED can be spread via aerosolization with manure spreading, the bigger thing is going to be tracking it into the barn. That's where the vast majority, it's either it's either comes in with the pigs or it's tracked into the barn via boots or contaminated equipment or contaminated hands, that sort of thing. So I would say as far as possible, there's not really a specific number. But if any, right now, PEDs across the whole province, so there's going to be tons and tons of field spread with PED contaminated manure this spring. So it's probably the best thing you can do is kind of follow those manure spreading protocols as best as possible, and then really lock down on your farm's biosecurity, making sure you're not walking it into your barn.
Excellent. Dr. Miltenberg, both of you as veterinarians made the comment about boots. We heard boots in stories that we know caused outbreaks, boots as part of your biosecurity. Can you just talk a little bit about boots? Like, what do you actually do when you get down to the practicals of boots?
Absolutely. And I'll speak to it a little bit from a dairy and beef perspective because I think boots are not as locked down generally on dairy and beef farms as they are on some swine and poultry farms. We tend to be a little bit more lax in accepting boots, work boots, drop by, just step in the door kind of boots without changing in some of our ruminant barns. And so definitely salmonella, for example, can live on boots that are undisinfected for 48 hours. So it is absolutely a risk. And as a livestock farmer, you get to make the protocols for what people need to do to enter your barn. And absolutely, I strongly encourage people to have a standard and hold people to it. As a visitor to many farms, I'm absolutely willing to do whatever you ask when I step in. But service providers, everybody from people who might be doing work on your farm, like a veterinarian or a AI technician, for example, or other individuals who are stopping by briefly, like a crop scout or your nutritionist. All of them are potentially are visiting multiple premises in one day. And so there is absolutely some risk from their footwear if they're not changing it, if they're not disinfecting it. And as I said, I'm particularly suspicious of the work boot, the non-rubber boot, because generally people put them on thinking that they're not really going into situations that are dirty, but they traverse through lots of common ground. And so I think we can set up boot washing stations. We can ask them to use boot covers, even if they're just coming into an office or a location, any location where you as the person working on your farm might wear the footwear that you're also just going to turn around and go back into animal housing with is important to consider as part of the risky zone. So even if they're not entering like full animal housing. So.
Yeah. It just further, Cole goes on basically asking that question in the chat, as somebody who's an inspector going to different barns all the time, Bill, as an example, and folks who are custom applicators going to different farms all the time. What do they actually disinfect their boots with? Are there specified products to use? Do you use the over boots? Any comments on that, either one of you or Connor?
Yeah, so is if you have inspectors or somebody going between multiple premises, you can use there's a number of different disinfectants that will be sufficient. The main thing is taking a look at the label of what you've got, because some of them have contact time that often people don't really observe, right? They kind of just swish and walk through very quickly. Whereas if you read the label, the contact time might require 60, 120 seconds. Some of them are even up to 5 minutes or 10 minutes, so these are important considerations. So if you are going to multiple operations in a day, and you need to be wearing something really industrious to complete your work. My best suggestion, especially if you have a farm that has somebody that comes regularly, like a veterinarian, a lot of them just have a pair of boots for the veterinarians that's there, size 9 for Dr. Voth or whoever it is, and that's what they wear when they enter their farm. If you're coming briefly, then plastic boots can be a good option. I don't think you should do a farm tour without having everybody put at least on plastic boots. Everybody hates them because they're noisy and annoying, but it is much better. It's better than nothing for sure. So I think it depends a little bit what level of work or industrious is needed for the person who's coming on and how regularly they're coming. But if they're coming regularly or not that often, but you're going to have them wear rubber boots, then we need a disinfection protocol, and they need to be enough time and they need to dry in order to meet that. Connor, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah. So yeah, just my, again, swine vet perspective. For me, if I'm visiting multiple sites in a day, it's extremely, extremely rare for me to visit different flows, but I know there's folks in the industry where it's not a pos. They have to visit different flows. So for me, if it's multiple sites in a day, it's usually the same pig flow. But I always have, yeah, those like disposable booties that cover your shoes. So I put them on when I'm walking out in the yard. And then for at least any pig barn, always want to see, barn boots, so they're boots that would never go outside. I like to see a nice line of separation, so it's very obvious for yourself and visitors kind of where outdoor boots end and barn boots begin. And there's no cross contamination between it because disinfection is great, washing the boots and applying disinfectant, but you run into some, at least in swine, some pathogens where if you stepped in a bunch of manure contaminated with PED, even if you clean them off super well and disinfect them, there's a possibility there could be a little bit of virus left, and doesn't really take much at all to infect a pig. So for me, it's really outdoor boots stay outside, clear line of separation, and then you have your barn boots. If you're visiting multiple sites, you're some sort of support person like a vet, then those booties work really well. So you don't have to be walking. So you're not really contaminating your shoes and boots in the first place.
Right on. Great. Bill, do you want to add anything here in terms of practically what's works for you in the business?
We avoid the barns as much as possible. We will never set foot in a pig barn for sure. Dairy barns we have gone in, but not very often. It's something we try to avoid. We're not supposed to be in there, so we don't go in there. It's just
Perfect.
we avoid it.
Yep. Yep. Good thought. I think this question probably goes to you, Dr. Miltenberg, about deer foraging in fields, winter risk. Is that a vector for spreading disease to other livestock?
Uh, yes, I suppose it's a potential route. Deer do shed pathogens that in their feces that would the cattle would be susceptible to potentially. They share a couple of diseases. They can have E. coli, they could have Johne's disease as well, some salmonellas that they might have. Similarly, couple of parasites are possible. I wouldn't say that the risk is high though. Like for example, over the winter where the deer will be defecating will be in small piles. They should be exposed to some, UV conditions. Now, potentially we do have some snow and wet conditions insulating it a little bit. So there is some risk potentially there, but it's not, high on my list. There are, it still does it's probably not very much in our control to keep the deer out of these fields. So only if the density was really high in a, just really abnormal manner would I start to be concerned about transmission from wildlife to livestock, but not an impossibility. So not a question. I do often get questions about deer to cattle risk, but not generally a huge factor when they share a lot of the same pathogens we already have circulating in our industry that come in various other routes from other farms or on people or on purchased animals.
Very good. Very good. Um, Walter, you talked about labor and OSHA and requirements, and Bill, you've got employees as well. I wonder if you have any comments on family labor and in the sense of safety, either one of you.
I have certainly worked with children. I teach my kids to weld when they're 6. I teach them to drive when they're 12. And the more they know, the more they're experienced. But I can't let them in the shop to work until they're 16 years old. So when I'm covered under OSHA or under work WSIB, then I can't have anyone under 16 working in the factory. And so that's a different regulation. When I'm setting up a farm show, I can't have any children under 16 setting up that farm show. And that's something that's changed when people become more aware of children getting hurt. We were out mixing a lagoon, agitating a lagoon, and my son, who at that time was 30 years old, but he was standing down on the bottom side of the lagoon, and I was on the top side. We were taking videos, and at the end of the day, he came out with a massive headache. So we know that mixing that lagoon, we were over 100 parts per million because he came out with this huge headache, and I was on the top side of the lagoon. So it wasn't. It was windy enough that he was getting the hydrogen sulfide and I wasn't getting it. And that's the other thing that I'd like to say. If we're going to be mixing a manure pit, if we're going to mix a barn with slats, we're inside a barn doing confined space mixing, that you never mix on a sultry day when you got to have a nice day when it's a high pressure, when the sun's out, when it's a gorgeous day. That's the day that you want to mix the barn, open up all the side curtains and then mix that pig barn. Because if you're in there on a cloudy, rainy, foggy day, you're going to lose some livestock. And that's because you're mixing the manure, and that risk of hydrogen sulfide is not going to get out of the barn because that air is not moving.
Yeah.
But yeah, keep your children safe. Tractor rollovers and tractor runovers is still the most dangerous thing in North America. The number of children that get run over, the number of tractors that run over the farmer for some miscellaneous reason is still the largest death that we have in North America.
Wow. Bill, do you want to add anything to Walter's comments?
We never had kids, so I never really had to deal with it firsthand. But I've had a lot of farmers with kids, and yeah, they always want to ride in the tractor, and they're always with you. Probably the safest place they can be if you're backing up manure tanks is right beside you in the seat because you can't see them; they're too small. And I've got a friend who run his kid over with a skid steer, and that still haunts him. The kid
Yeah,
was
you
always with
yeah.
him, and yeah, he
Well,
lost him.
uh,
He never remember that.
yeah, that's devastating.
Mhm.
Walter, there's one more question here in the chat. I know we're at end time here, but and I think you did allude to this in your story. The question is about gas risk when you're agitating an outdoor lagoon.
Right. Yes. And I did mention that about the farmer in Wisconsin who was just walking past the manure pit. He wasn't doing the job. He wasn't doing anything. He was just walking past the manure pit while they were agitating. And he was succumbed to hydrogen sulfide and passed away. So remember, it's one breath that can kill. You breathe in, you don't breathe out. And so I think that's important to leave this discussion today is to remember to be safe and always be cautious and vigilant.
I think those are excellent closing words right there. Listen, I want to thank all our panelists here for a great discussion, a very frank discussion, and please, everybody, consider this in your work. I trust that we have a safe and productive spring as we get the equipment rolling and we get the manure out. So please consider this. Thank you again. Next week, we have our final March Manure Monday, and we're talking about organic amendments and contaminants. So obviously organic amendments, which have nutrient value and soil health benefits, but some of them do contain some contaminants that we need to be aware of. And so we have some experts coming in to talk about that for our final. So same time, same place next Monday. We'll see you. Thanks for joining us today. Cheers.